Thank you very much, Joan. It's hard to live up to that introduction. Thank you to everyone who's come tonight in person and to everyone online, and to everyone who helped in organising, Luke Moffat, Cheryl Lawther, and Declan Coyle, who always is outstanding at these events, and of course for Richard for all the technical support. So what today I'm going to do is I'm going to imagine this island as a feminist one. I'm going to imagine an island where all the dreams, ideas, aspirations and needs that women have long articulated and claimed happened. And this happened on the island of Hy Brasil. Now, Hy Brasil existed on many maps for centuries, right up to the 1800s, and was said to be off the west coast. Often to be off the west coast of Cork, where I have spent many happy summer holidays on the Beara Peninsula in a place called Allihies. And there is something that you can see on the horizon from Allihies every so often, and somewhere between the Skelligs and the Bull Rock. And when you see it, a member of my family would often say, "There is Hy Brasil." And for many years, I thought it was actually a genuine place. And for our purposes today, it is. It is a place where a specific Irish feminist society exists that is built on a world already imagined by many women across this island. A place that currently can only be glimpsed, but is very much a possibility. To do this, I'm going to employ some of the tools that I've used across my career. Often these were in collaboration with others, sometimes on my own, but always, and this is essential to any feminist legal work, in recognition of the labour of others and their ideas on which I build. This is very much a snapshot of a particular moment in my career that looks back over what I've previously done, my present concerns, and where currently we may go. This includes prefiguration, feminist utopias, manifestos, feminist legal history, including hagiographies, feminist constitutions and judgments, and law and the arts. And from it is there that I will build my feminist society on Hy Brasil. Before jumping into that detail, I want to first explain the title of the lecture. Over the course of my career, I have been struck by a set of emotions that hit me when I returned to the period leading up to the creation of the two jurisdictions on this island, and the women who were heavily invested and engaged with prefiguring the new states in which they wanted to live. It has taken me a long time to articulate exactly what it is that I am feeling in those moments. Anger, yes, at what was lost. Inspiration to drive forward and fight for an island in which I can be all that I can be, and so can my daughters, my sister, my mother, my friends and colleagues, but also something else. It was reading Julie Morrissey's work, the poet, Radical Women in the Irish Revolution, completed during her tenancy as poet-in-residence at the National Library of Ireland, that it finally occurred to me what it was. In this work, Julie's words intermingle with the women of this period. This is in a tradition of feminist dialogue, where women speak across time to each other. Women's voices are very often absent in the linear historical and legal narrative, because their voices are rarely facilitated by the histories that are written. But as Julie does across her documentary poetry, she leaps across time to talk with each other across different moments that can aid in our own understanding of our contexts. And this excerpt is from Julie's poem, An Appreciation for Annie O'Farrelly. I am lonely for them, for the women I never knew, the ones who did not make it into my classrooms. I recall the pages, the photographs of Pearse and Collins. I am lonely for those days of change, lonely for all we achieved and all we haven't yet. In the words of the poem, I found what I was feeling, and it was that I was lonely for them, lonely for their stories, their words, their ideas, and lonely for the Ireland that I thought was coming and has not yet. I also identified that across my work, this is perhaps what's driven me towards key aspects of my research, and on my own or in my collaborative projects. So I'm now going to engage in some prefiguration. I'm going to act as if, on Hy Brasil, the world that women have imagined for this island has and is in the process of being created. So, prefiguration. Prefiguration is an important act of legal imagination. We need to imagine the future we want to create and think about the laws that may support us getting to that future. When we prefigure, we act as if these imaginings have become reality. We explore what that feminist society would look like, how it would work, what its laws might be. It is what Davina Cooper describes as having an adventure and rehearsing for what might come. Prefiguring allows us to revisit the sites of lawmaking that occur outside state apparatus that we only really recognise when it happens in the masculine register. When the gender of those doing it is unexpected, it tends not to count. We can play and we can talk as if things deemed unfeasible are possible. We can embrace laws and determinacy and think about life on this island. Might we have made other choices, and think about the choices that are open to us now. This picture is taken from Ballydonegan Beach in Beara, looking out towards the Atlantic, out towards High Brazel. So I'm going to commence with utopias. Now, over the past few years with Ruth Houghton at Newcastle Law School, I've done a lot of work on feminist and more recently on imperial utopias. This has been a tremendous amount of fun, and working with Ruth is one of the most fruitful parts of my career. We run an interdisciplinary prefigurative reading group where a variety of utopian thinking from across the world enriches my understanding of what prefiguration means. You're all welcome to join, just send me an email. We consider how utopian ideas impact on the law and whose utopias we live in now, and why a utopian feminist process of constituent power might be different. A quick and important point to make here is that utopias have served imperialism, eugenics and racism. Indeed, Thomas More's utopia commences with the elimination of the indigenous population. The utopia I'm imagining here is very much in a critical feminist form, a place that never reaches its endpoint, that has no blueprint of exactly how we should live, but rather a place where collectively we constantly look to see how we can make a world that everyone can thrive, imagine, love and have some fun. Here I'm going to discuss two Irish utopias. The first is High Brazel itself, and the second the creation of Amelia Garland Mears in 1895, Mercia, the Astronomer Royal. So I'm placing my utopia on High Brazel. Now, High Brazel first appeared in maps of Ireland around 1325 and kept appearing up until the 1800s. Some claimed to have landed on it or seen it. Some say it appears every 7 years. It's sometimes linked to the afterlife, sometimes linked to healing. The novelist and playwright Gerald Griffin, who incidentally the primary school that I went to is actually the street that it's on is named after him, wrote a poem about it called O Brazel, the Isle of the Blessed, which I'm going to read from now. On the ocean that hollows the rocks where ye dwell, a shadowy land has appeared as they tell. Men thought it a region of sunshine and rest, and they called it O Brazel, the Isle of the Blessed. From year unto year on the ocean's blue rim, the beautiful spectre showed lovely and dim. The golden clouds curtained the deep where it lay, and it looked like an Eden, away, far away. Griffin's poem ends with a stark warning against searching for High Brazel, a warning I am not going to heed. I am instead going to prefigure High Brazel as a place where the Feminist Society imagined happened. So Jack Fennell at the University of Limerick brought Amelia Garland Mears and her work to my attention. The Astronomer Royal is a fascinating account of the world as she imagined from 1895, but in 2022. While there are elements that I would not subscribe to, true of all utopias, even feminist ones, much of what she writes shows that in 1895, women were imagining a world where they were equal. What is remarkable about her work in particular is that she explains how it took to get there, something most of the predecessor work contemporaries and successors actually failed to do. Amelia Mears was born in County Kilkenny, but much like me, lived much of her adult life in the northeast of England, gaining certificates from Durham University, where I also spent, as Joan mentioned, a very happy 15 years, where I learned a huge amount about being an academic and also how to have fun while doing so. Mears describes the bumpy path towards gender equality, which is still, in her 2022, ongoing. A good 70 years before the advent of critical feminist utopias that moved away from blueprints and final destinations, Mears understood that feminist utopias were ongoing, collective, deliberative projects. She describes women in 1895 as cramped and crippled by old-time conventionalities, the outcome of the customs and prejudices of medieval ignorance and tyranny. And that attempts to change this was met by loud and bitter railings from the dominant sex. She describes how getting to 2022 was a long battle and a hard struggle for equality. Slowly and by almost imperceptible degrees, she won one concession and then another, until by the time of the second millenary was reached, her great ambition was achieved. So by her 2022, social, political and marital equality have been achieved. So in my high Brazil, that has been achieved. But what does that actually mean? So the first is there is no gender pay gap. And this is remarkable in 1895 that she's writing this. Women, she says, earn more than men in similar roles if they have more experience or have the advantage of superior training, something we still struggle to do today. She also describes how work done traditionally by women are now well valued. For instance, cleaning and cooking, that doing these jobs is now well paid in recognition of the skills of those work. So all work is valued, not even the ones that are associated with the feminine. There is also reproductive justice and childcare. So many in the late 1800s and early 1900s, including feminists, reach for eugenics, stereotypes of the poor or racism when building their utopias, but not Mears. Well ahead of the Sustainable Development Goals in their identification of women's education, good governance and gender equality with population health and education, Mears argued it was educational opportunities, including full healthcare education and access to the public sphere, that would go to serve population control. She argued that the laws of health is taught in all schools, sex education in other words, and every man knows how to control his own body, putting the responsibility for birth control on men. This over time led to smaller families and better outcomes for women and for their children, and also presumably prevented the law from hyper-regulating women's bodies. So there is reproductive justice and there is also good childcare. Because contraception is everyone's responsibility and everyone is provided with sex educations, women's reproductive health has vastly improved because of a long process of education, but also because women have full access and full members of the public sphere. And this is achieved through the provision of childcare and care for the elderly, an area which the law rarely supports and where the law has continued to place women in the private sphere. Another element to it is that women are believed in courts. Now, as I mentioned, these changes took time and effort, and not all of it can be achieved through law. It remains a process for Mears that is underway. So the core story, the core narrative in the book, follows Mercia, the astronomer royal, who was sexually harassed by the emperor. She attempts to leave the position, is prevented from doing so, and he attempts to harass her again, and she defends herself and is charged with assault. The case then goes to trial, but she manages to prove her version of events in court. Mears is clear that while progress has been made, there remains problems and that any successes must be defended. The reality is that in courts, women are often not believed. In the Northern/Ireland Feminist Judgments Project, there were many, many examples of women's account of their lives, their knowledge, their common sense, not being held to have the same value. The responses from governments about the mother and baby homes or the Magdalen Laundries better in Northern Ireland than in Dublin remains one where the account that women give of what happened to them counts for less. I was very lucky to be working with Claire McGlynn and Erica Rackley when myself and Mairead Enright and Julie McCandless started the Northern/Irish project. And lucky that Rosemary Hunter, the third co-lead of the English project, was always on hand to help, to support and to advise. And all three continue to be. And particularly Claire McGlynn, who taught me very well how to be a good feminist academic and as an excellent mentor. The global network of feminist judgment projects from Canada through Australia, India, New Zealand and the US and more are a wonderful collective of supportive feminist academic life in action. So judgments in High Brazil are feminist judgments. Judgments, the use of words and descriptors are not based in stereotype. The expert in a woman's life and her body are herself. The information that is included or excluded and what is counted as something everybody knows, or when general statements are made, are not just what the heteronormative white male knows, while everything else must be underscored. There is frank acknowledgement of political context, and where there are trade-offs, which often are the case in law, these are made clear. Judgments are collegial and written in solidarity, where women's sexual history, women's socio-economic status, or women's emotional recounting of events are not used as ways to believe them less, but rather as ways to narrate a life. Mears' work is prescient, not just from imagining a feminist utopia science fiction, one of the very first and very unusual for its time, but also equally interesting discussion of the difficulties of getting to a utopia. The fact that legal and political formal equality would not be sufficient, that societal changes were also necessary, and that this was an ongoing process, even where, as is sometimes claimed, that feminism is no longer necessary, it absolutely is. Mears was making that claim in 1895, and many would repeatedly make those claims and are still making them today. So moving next to anti-hagiographies. So I explore in my work how hagiographies create legal canon. The people who are the canonical authors, who we frequently cite, are in touchstones of discourse. In UK public law, you could think of somebody like A.V. Dicey or G.A.G. Griffith as your examples. My argument is that if the canon is entirely made up of people who are alike, it is very hard for individuals who are not like them to identify themselves and aspire to those roles. In Article 38.1 of the Statute of the International Court of Justice, these are the highly qualified publicists who are subsidiary sources of law. A very narrow group of dead white men, so people like Grotius and Puffendorf, they maintain international law, despite its name, as a very European parochial creation. It also means the ranges of experiences and knowledges that is necessary to make good law is absent. Further, often these men are forgiven their foibles, or they are at least downplayed because their genius is such that they may be discarded as irrelevant to their work. In law, this is particularly problematic where their legal genius is seen as immutable and beyond politics, even though law, as it rightly should be, is an output of democracy. So their politics, no matter perhaps it's misogyny, it's racism, it's ableism, it's homophobia, even if common for their time, and then, it's important to remember, would still have been challenged as Mears in 1895 demonstrates, is forgotten. So I propose an anti-hagiographical account establishing a canon of self-identification with those who'd wish to be, for those we would wish to emulate, that do not fulfil the canonical mode of great men. This also returns me to Julie Morrissey's poem and the Collins and Pearce of my childhood textbooks as the authors of the state that I grew up in, but there were many, many women missing from that account. Now, there are many, many candidates that I could have picked for this anti-hagiographical account. But as I was writing this, the journalist and co-founder of the Irish Women's Liberation Movement, Nell McCafferty, died. And I thought she would be a great candidate. McCafferty is very much an author of the world that I now live in. What follows is a way of thinking about anti-hagiographies. So the first, and I'm going to take the first and second together, is that anti-hagiographies are contingent. There is a relationship between the author, the reader, the subject, and the context, and that is provisional and shifts. And it's also subjective. It is a subjective choice of who you pick. So I place myself in that context. It is contingent and it is subjective. So on hearing of Nell McCafferty's death, I was reminded what a common figure of my childhood she was, whether that was on radio or television or in print. This was, I think, because not only was she one of the few women present with an accent from Northern Ireland, and I too am subject to that societal problem that when a woman speaks, we all assume that she has spoken for far more than she has, just simply because of the unusual tenor of the voice, a point she made emphatically herself. It is telling that RTE showed a clip of her calling out all the male voices on the radio and television, where she argued that women were an invisible species, but not what followed, where she placed Marion Finucane, the journalist, in Gay Byrne's seat on The Late Late Show as the first woman to host the show, a position that Finucane still holds. My relationship to her is contingent. It was as my childhood as this forthright figure, eager and willing to be awkward. But it is different to the one I have now, knowing what she was saying more fully, what she was against, but also things that she said and did that I would not necessarily agree with. It is a subjective choice, a choice from my childhood. Third, reorientating the public space. In her Late Late Show appearances, Nell was also undertaking another feature of the anti-hagiography. She was claiming space for herself, but also for other women. She didn't put herself in Gay Byrne's seat, she put Marion Finucane. Reporting on district court cases in her column in the Irish Times, In the Eyes of the Law, she told the stories of the very ordinary people that ended up before the courts, often for very petty things, often in systems of poverty from which they could not escape. These people were allowed to take up room and space and be heard in Nell's columns. She also led the invasion of the 40-foot in Dublin, which is a fairly famous swimming spot, a men's only swimming spot at the time, much like Portmarnock Golf Club or the Garrick in London, taking over a site of privilege and power long before wild swimming became a thing. putting women's bodies where they were not supposed to be. She, like Hannah Sheehy Skeffington and the other women judges of the Doyle courts, reorientated public spaces, or like Belfast suffragette Letitia Ellis Wallington, the first to graduate with a law degree in 1888, where she was claiming the male spaces of legal education. And like the women on the walls here above me, breaking up to what is referred to by Orla O'Donoghue, referencing, unfortunately, my alma mater, UCC, but applicable in a lot of places, but not here, where I have some women here to keep me company, as the dude walls of academia. Fourth, radical forgetting, radical remembering. Nell McCarthy was one of the founding members of the Irish Women's Liberation Movement in 1971. And this moment is important to remember the contexts that are constructed. This year, in O'Mara versus Minister for Social Protection, a case we use in the Feminist Constitutions project that I will return to, the Irish Supreme Court constructed the context in which the original family provisions of the Irish Constitution, Bunreacht na hÉireann, and Article 41 in the family were written, alongside a 1966 case, the State Nicolau versus An Bord Uachtála. The court's contextual construction is of a deeply conservative country in both 1937 and 1966. The large and vocal opposition to the 1937 Constitution, including to Article 41 by many feminist groups, and its narrow passage is not part of the context that the court chooses to highlight. The 1966 case is also contextualised as occurring in a deeply conservative society. And this is important because it's entirely apart from the precedent and its use as a precedent by the court. But this disregards the arrival of the Irish Women's Liberation Movement in 1971, or indeed the McGee case in the Irish Supreme Court in 1973 on contraception. If we radically remember the Irish Women's Liberation Movement's manifesto and the feminist opposition to 1937's constitution, we can see a quite different, complicated and messy reality. Yes, of course, there was conservatism, but there was also always opposition. It was never a homogenous view of what the law should or could be. So if we look to the Irish Women's Liberation Manifesto, called Chains or Change in 1971, they called for equal rights in law, equal pay and removal of the marriage bar, justice for widows, single mothers and deserted wives, equal educational opportunities, the right to contraception, one family, one house. This is a very different context to the one set out by the Supreme Court. In radically remembering these moments, we remember that contexts are always constructed and that women were always active and present and claiming a right to legal change. The other women of the liberation movement, Maureen Johnston, June Levine, Margaret Gadge, Maureen de Burka, Rosita Sweetman, and the many others, but are also members of my and Hy-Brasil's anti-hagiography. I'm going also to take 5 and 6 together, non-linearity and feminist communication. With Nell, this is particularly easy because the things for which she stood for and argued for still resonate. For governments to be up in front and open about both historical and current events. Her reporting on the Kerry Babies case, for instance, and her book that followed, A Woman to Blame, is a splendid example of this. Also, her fights for reproductive justice. She was famously part of the contraceptive train that travelled from Belfast to Dublin in 1971 alongside the other members of the Irish Women's Liberation Movement. When they got back to Dublin, they loudly proclaimed what they had at customs. This was not quiet or civilised violation of the law. This was an active public violation, risking social opprobrium and arrest. And alongside the condoms, they actually had aspirin because they couldn't buy the pill over the counter in Belfast, but they pretended they had it anyway. They marched through the gates with their contraceptives high in the air. That moment of defiance, of claiming rights of bodily autonomy, of sexual freedom, of being loud and brash, speaks to our present and of cross-border feminist action. It speaks to us of the very recent changes in Northern Ireland and Ireland on reproductive access, but also of the backward march that is occurring in the United States following Dobbs versus Jackson's Women's Health Organisation in the Supreme Court in 2022. As Mears argued in The Astronomer Royal, things can regress and we must always fight. And being loud and brash and defiant is and always has been necessary. These events in 1971 jump across time in fits and start and are as relevant to describing that context as they are today. Now, 7th, the heteronormative structures of law. Nell was a working-class lesbian from Derry, where to be that and have a career as a journalist was extremely hard, and something that was used to sideline and silence her, and something I would imagine that to this day is difficult. Queer Ireland and Queer Northern Ireland, and people like David Norris or Jeff Dudgeon, who took their cases all the way to the European Court of Human Rights, or Mark Ashton, who grew up in Portrush and whose first Pride in 2023 was dedicated to. He was one of the leaders of the Lesbians and Gay Support, the Miners Group, which during the 1980s miners' strike stood up for workers' rights. These are all part of my queer anti-hagiography of High Brasil. But also someone like James Barry from Cork, who formed the first modern C-section, locked horns with Florence Nightingale, and who lived their entire adult life as a man to enable them to enter the professional world. James Barry pushed themselves into the male world, into the public sphere, and impacted the world by doing so. But we don't know, was this because of the societal and legal constraints of the time, what James Barry's true, authentic self actually was. Each of their lives was and is impactful and continue to be impacted by heteronormative legal structures. They all easily fit into an anti-hagiographical canon because they, in different ways, disrupted these heteronormative structures by claiming lives closer to who they were and not who the law sought them to be. 8. Post-colonialism. Now, in law across the island, there has scarcely been any thought given to the post-colonial context, albeit there are likely post-colonial reasons for that reticence. With Ilan Wall, who I'm delighted made the trip from Galway, sitting in the corner, and Mark Cohen at UCD, we're taking initial steps to think about that. For Nell McCafferty, being from Derry, and her experiences of the Troubles and what followed is essential to who she was. To be post-colonial is also to see beyond the lines and maps and ideas of the state drawn up in different times and contexts, and to regard a society as something more than the state. To be transversal and a transversal feminist is to cross lines and divides and work for collective action, is a form of feminist activism that is common in different ways and forms across the island. Sharing methods, advocating for and allying with our sisters on the island, in the diaspora, and everywhere feminists are acting and thinking through law is a post-colonial act. But post-colonialism is in some spaces an awkward conversation to have about the law. But Nell McCafferty was also great at bringing up awkward conversations. So in High Brasil, awkward conversations or conversations that cause us to reflect are essential. A fear that a topic might upset some, though we don't in reality know that it actually will, is not shied away from if it is important. High Brasil is a place that has many histories, many contexts, where people from all over the world live and thrive. Post-colonial contexts are essential to these awkward conversations, but also processes of remembering and revisiting, but also, importantly, moving forward. 9th, reconstituting contexts. Now, Brian O'Neill, in his obituary of Nell McCafferty and Slugger O'Toole, wrote that she was entirely impervious to direction, and further that she held the establishment to account and they did not like it. This too is an important part of the value that I place in Nell and to figures like her. But the focus on her prickliness rather than the impact she had, you can see across many, though not all, of the obituaries. And it is a problem in the way that women are characterised. I had a similar experience looking at the first chair in law in the UK or Ireland, Frances Moran at Trinity, and she was also the first woman in the island to take silk. Her obituary talks about her voice and how you'd not meet her in the supermarket. And even when I would comment about this to often quite senior legal people, they generally say, well, people who knew her say she was not very nice. Now, she may very well have not been very nice, but that is kind of the point of the anti-hagiography, is that we accept that people have any variations in their character. Now, importantly, this is not an excuse for misogyny, for racism, for being homophobic or anti-traveller, but rather being impervious to direction is just something about being alive. Not being very nice is rarely something that puts you out of the canon of the great lawyers. There are many great scholars, both alive and dead, who are public and private bullies, and worse, but who seem to be allowed to carry on. Women are imperfect, but acknowledging all our imperfections makes you ideal for the anti-hagiography. We can only really self-identify if we know that other people have foibles too. So coming out of the anti-hagiography, we've got the canon, it's LGBTQ, queer access, we have our awkward conversations. So moving on to manifestos and constituent power. So I work on manifestos with Ruth Houghton, and they are a tremendous form of education and great to read, and I would commend them all to you. And we argue they are a form, in some contexts, of constituent power. So constituent power, the power to make, remake, or break apart the fundamentals of a legal order, is the ultimate democratic power that any of us can claim. They are also great sites of feminist communication over time. So the Lowell Factories Girls Association Constitution, and they were girls, they were all in their early teens, though being a teenager didn't exist in 1836 when it was written. It's incredible the basic things they were claiming, right? Freedom from sexual harassment, fair pay, safety at work, and more, how they articulated it and reading it, it really resonated with me and spoke across time. Myself and Ruth, we wrote a manifesto ourselves actually before we did any of the research, which is probably the way to do it. And we made it into a zine, which you can partly see under the guidance of the great Joy Trimlow at Durham. The way we recognise documents, say like the 1916 Proclamation or the Ulster Covenant, as documents claiming constituent power, claims to be able to lay foundations for the state or preserve the state, is rarely recognised when women make similar claims. Some manifestos follow very traditional models. So Olympia de Gouges, who is the lady in that photograph, or the lady on my pencil case, she wrote in 1791 the Declarations of the Rights of Women at the same time as the Declaration of the Rights of Men. So we can include her declaration, her manifesto in High Brasil and in the Hagiography. In her declaration, she states, "The law should be the expression of the general will. All citizenesses and citizens should take part, in person or by their representatives, in its formation. It must be the same for everyone. All citizenesses and citizens being equal in its eyes should be equally admissible to all public dignitaries, offices and employments, according to their ability and with no other distinction than that of their virtues and talents." Olympia de Gouges was also fiercely anti-slavery, writing places that demonstrate that where she meant all, she truly meant everyone, which was important in the context of the Haitian Revolution that was also happening at the same time. She ultimately paid for her political views at the guillotine. Now, some women's manifestos, like the Dyke Manifesto, specifically reject sincerity or following or copying or echoing the masculine manifestos. Because when they copy it sincerely, it is still ignored. As the Dyke Manifesto states, they are still silenced. Others take other forms through dance or craft or plays or poems. Now, in the traditional manifestos, Patrick Hanafin describes the 1937 Constitution Bunnock na HÉireann as a phallocentric manifesto in, I quote, "how a patriarchal cultural narrative insinuated itself into the legal narrative. Thus, the traditional masculine history of Ireland became the way in which law's story was told in the constitutional narrative." High Brasil will not have the 1937 phallocentric manifesto, but also will not have similar masculine constitutional narratives from across the island, or all our islands collectively, or international law, I should add. These will either not have come into force or will have been replaced with exercises of feminist constituent power. Now, we've already mentioned the Irish Women's Liberation Movement's manifesto, but there are also several others. One of my personal favourite is the Rural Women's Manifesto from the Northern Ireland Rural Women's Network, and it makes a fantastic edition, and it's available online, and I would commend it to all of you to read it. In it, they list, amongst many other things, caring responsibilities to be recognised and supported, including rural proofing, frequent, reliable rural transport, education and training and rural development, elimination of rural poverty and social isolation. While law is not the only tool to resolve these issues, legal mandates do exist regarding rights to education that can easily accommodate these claims. A right to healthcare would incorporate more, and if we understood democracy as requiring a thick, engaged public sphere, rural transport and development could easily be included. It would also include, as they claim, a recognition of care. Now, if we take the great African-American feminist writer Bell Hooks, who is also in my anti-hagiography, she argues that the political idea of love means care, affection, recognition, respect, commitment and trust, as well as honest and open communications. Then care in that scenario becomes a legal imperative. But also, from Bell Hooks, it must be intersectional. The rural and the urban, the old and the young, traveller, disabled, black, white, of all religions and of none. In Search of High Brazil was Ireland's entry at the Venice Architectural Biennial in 2023, and I will come back to it. And what they were arguing is linked to what I'm saying here. They talk about the vast combined territory of land and ocean we call our home. The non-human world around us and our engagement with it, and not as something that is ours to be exploited, but rather things that have their value and worth entirely in part from the value as a human we place on it, because it is home to many across the islands and the ocean and the rivers and the lakes that we inhabit and live next to and beside. So in High Brazil, we are mandated to care, to love, to publicly active, engaged spaces, to be intersectional, to see the world around us, and also to have that multi-generational wit, the young and the old. So Northern/Ireland feminist constitutionalism. So in this project with Mairead Enright and Catherine O'Rourke, we've been doing a full range of activities. Part of this has been to think about what kinds of ceremonies might accompany a feminist constitution. So if you think of the swearing in of a president or the recent coronation or the opening of Parliament, what ceremonies of this kind would we have? As FemCon, we approached artists and members of the collective Array, Emma Campbell and Grace McMurray, to look at the possibilities of feminist constitutional futures through the lens of art. In considering where to commence a West Cork cloak, which had belonged to my great-grandmother, Hannah Hurley was proposed as inspiration. And Hannah also belongs in my anti-hagiographical canon. Born in 1873, she lived through remarkable change. But even her claims to any of the new states in which she belonged were denied because, for instance, she went for a state pension, she had a single cow, and despite being a widowed subsistence farmer, she was denied that pension. But her resilience and the impact that it had on me, though I never met her, it puts her firmly in my canon. West Cork cloaks and their equivalents across the island, they varied in colours. In Cork they were black, were worn by ordinary women. They were coats and were still being worn by a very small number into the 1960s when Hannah died and when that photograph was taken. The embroidery on the back of the one that you can see that was made for the project has a quote from the political feminist constitution of the state, "The impossible country we build as women," a manifesto written by Bolivian feminists, Mujeres Corriendo, during their period of constitutional change. The embroidery, completed by Grace, includes the following. There are mirrors and metaphors for societies, ladies and strivers to look through, for single mothers and grandmothers raising children, for secretaries, for hysterics and prudes, the unemployed and others, for all those who are looking for the breaking point in society, the place of rupture and rebellion, rather than the conciliation of silence and the comfortable complicity of our own subjection. High Brazil will have ceremonies, but not ones of awe. While the performance of law is important, but these performances will be to inspire ourselves and each other. The performative nature of law, not to overcome with power or to be in awe, but rather the shared power to change the state and make it into the feminist society that we would wish. Now, as I mentioned, In Search of High Brazil was Ireland's entry at the Venice Architectural Biennial in 2023. And what they argued for was putting our island's diverse communities, cultures and experiences right at the centre of the discourse surrounding our shared future, to the forefront of our imagination. And imagination is particularly important for me here. Building a feminist society is more than the law. But the claiming and recognition of the right to build, to constitute, to create is essential to law, and often using the tools that I have outlined today, but just in a masculine register. When the Bolivian feminists called it the impossible country, this was not because a feminist society can never happen, but rather because it's a legal process of imagination that never ends. It's also not impossible because we cannot do it, that the wit is beyond us. But rather, as Thomas Paine argued in 1775, every generation is as capable as the next. Or to put it in another way, as Judith Butler writes, and one of the great privileges of being an academic is being constantly meeting every new generation as they come through the university. And she writes in her book and her dedication, "For the young people who still teach me, because they too have the wit needed to create a feminist society." So this is my feminist society. It by no means is a finished product, and I would have done it differently a decade ago, and no doubt I would do it differently in a decade's time. Like Mears in 1895 and her vision of 2022, some of it may prove prescient, but some may not. And that is a good thing. For it is only from keeping learning from those around us, by communicating, having the crack with each other, and welcoming new knowledge, understanding and wisdom, can we keep going in making Hy Brasil a reality across the island. Now, coming back to the title, in Hy Brasil, loneliness is not eradicated. It is emotional value, like all emotions, and a reminder that the world can still be worked upon and created. Remembering and radically remembering unrecognized acts of claiming constituent power is essential as it is to tell those women's stories. It is an adventure, and I would add the crack, of imagining a feminist society to live in. And crack or fun is an important facet. All the many collaborative feminist spaces that I have been part of, no matter the seriousness of the topic, has also always been a place of fun and joy and shared crack. We are not at Hy Brasil yet, but I would commend to you that the choices we make, and particularly for me, the legal choices we make, and who we recognise as having the power to make those choices, and when we get to make them, is an essential facet of how we get there. I will end with Nell McCafferty and her famous sign-off to just not you in the room and those of you who are online and still here, but also to the women in Julie Morrissey's work and to the members of the anti-hagiography, and say, good night, sisters. Thank you.